Yeah, I added this. Uh, Most of the project CLIs have already migrated to OpenStack client, like Nova, Keystone, Neutron, and even Nova doesn't accept new command line changes in Nova client. It just accepts changes when OpenStack client is calling the methods. Um, and Glance recently agreed to do that as well. So that just leaves us using the Cinder client and all of our new features being added to it. Uh, there is a doc. So Stephen Finucane, along with I think some interns who have been working on past few cycles to bridge the gap between the commands we had in Cinder client and in OpenStack client. Even the micro version support, I think he was able to uh, complete it. And there were still some concerns which are mentioned in the review patch I mentioned. So Stephen added a patch for deprecating the Cinder CLI, and I discussed with the team, I think, in some Cinder meeting, and I added the feedback there. So there were a few concerns like we don't have any active member as part of the core team of OpenStack client. So any changes done to the uh, Cinder part of OpenStack client doesn't get validated with the Cinder course. So that seemed to be a big problem, to which Stephen agreed like it is possible, like they could add someone, could act as a liaison between the two projects. Another thing was so this doc only mentions about the commands we have, like the Cinder client command and the OpenStack client equivalent, but it doesn't mention all the optional parameters we have. So we are still not sure if everything works as we expect it to work. And even I think there were some cases mentioned where the OpenStack client was very ambiguous to what we do in Cinder client. I mean, the operation that we were performing, the parameters were like not very clear that that was the kind of operation we were performing. It is also mentioned in the comment on the Cinder client patch. And yeah, I think there were some more concerns, but moreover, like we need to actively check to in OpenStack client if all the gaps are bridged, and then I think it is the right direction that other projects are taking. So we will also soon be migrating to OpenStack client. And yeah, I guess we need to. So it's better if we start preparing for it.
The OpenStack client uses the OpenStack SDK, correct?
Yeah.
And I think one of the last times I looked, the OpenStack SDK doesn't contain all of the features that the underlying capabilities that are in Cinder itself. Because I've actually written a lot of tools that had to that tried to use the OpenStack SDK because that's where most people are trying to go. But then I realized that some basic stuff wasn't there, and I think there was a patch that recently added some of the stuff, but I don't believe it's all there yet. So um, I would argue that we shouldn't deprecate the Cinder client until all of the features are in the OpenStack SDK that Cinder client actually supports.
Yeah, that's right. And that's Uh, yeah, sorry, Luca. I was just saying like that's what we have in mind until everything is bridged, the gaps are bridged, we won't be deprecating it.
For what it's worth, the majority of my team and my clients they use the OpenStack client to do Cinder stuff. I'm pretty much the only one that uses the Cinder client because I know it has more features than OpenStack client.
Yeah, many customers use the OpenStack client, and most of the documentation, our documentation tries to use the OpenStack client. Yeah, I just don't use it if I can avoid it. It's slow, and I don't even know the commands. for the volume stuff. Sometimes I have trouble figuring out which one is the command that I have to use.
Yeah, I never use it.
That's just a matter of habits, because if you started with the other, you can say the same things. On the other hand, I think we had the best person to answer is Stefan, probably.
Time. And so it takes 3 times as long to run a command with the OpenStack client as it does with Cinder. 3 times. Not to mention that there are things that are very funny. You try to create an empty volume, and if Glance is not running and Keystone does not have a Glance endpoint, you will not be able to create a Cinder empty volume. Because I don't know what the OpenStack client does, that it tries to get something from Glance for an empty volume. So there are additional things that are painful. Sure. Anyway.
But if they are not pointed out, I think the maintainers, I think Stephen pointed out some discussion, maybe it was an internal discussion now that I think about that, but they are not things that cannot be solved if, it's the things that if no one starts working on them or even reporting them, no one is going to work on fix on them. On their side, they said that there are a lot of people now, they have a lot of interns and people working on them, and Cinder is going to be basically, and Glance, they are going to be basically the last one not switching. So it may happen, it's going to happen at some point. It's just that it may be accelerated a bit if we provide some hints. Oh,
yeah,
the right person.
Hello,
Stephen.
I was just mentioning that there are some reasons why some of us are not using it. Not saying that we are not going to change. We are going to change. That is a fact. Mm-hmm. So, yep.
Stephen is around to answer some of the question. I think Walt had some regarding the OpenStack SDK. Like we still have some gaps remaining there.
Sure. Could Stephen outline like the basic architecture of the OpenStack client these days? Because it's evolved, and I'm not sure. What I'm interested in is, does it use the individual client code at all? Does it use only SDK? What's the relationship with Shade, or is that like something we shouldn't even be thinking about? And then, what's the overlay? So with the OpenStack client, is it command line only, or is it supposed to be used as a client, as a like Python language bindings, or is that the role of the SDK? I just want to understand how these things hang together.
Sure. So I'll take it from Nova's perspective, because I get Cinder slightly different in that it can be used as its own project without the rest of the OpenStack ecosystem. But for Nova, the long-term goal is that Nova client dies. We have OpenStack SDK as our library, and we have OpenStack client as our command line shell utility. And Ansible uses OpenStack SDK under the hood, and then a human should use OpenStack client to interact with it from Bash or Fish or whatever. Shade is dead. Shade has been merged into OpenStack SDK. And if you have a look, and that's gone with a while, the project is still technically there, but nobody has merged anything into it since Monty left, so 4 years or whatever. And it was, the only reason it wasn't killed was to give people a chance to migrate over to OpenStack SDK, but it should have no users anymore. From an OpenStack SDK perspective, there's 3 layers, which is how they were able to kill Shade. So the first layer is, we'll say, the resource layer. So by we, I mean Monty has abused set attributes and get attributes to allow you to have objects that you can set attributes to, and then call like a commit method, and it'll do all the API calls, call a delete method, not delete the Python keyword now, or del the Python keyword, but like .delete, it'll delete the thing on the server, stuff like that. I don't imagine anyone interacts with those directly because they're quite troublesome to interact with. So most people would generally use the next layer up, which is the proxy layer, which gives you simple enough, like from a Nova perspective, like .create server, I'd say would probably be an API. So it'd be like OpenStack. Sorry, you create a connection with OpenStack SDK, connection dot compute dot create server, parameters that are being fed in almost verbatim into the OpenStack server or the Nova server, Nova API. And then a final layer is the cloud layer, which is supposed to do things that an end user, by which I mean an operator, would like to do. So string a couple of different operations together. So for example, I don't know if this is actually a good example, but I guess Glance, if you wanted to upload an image, it might string the creating an empty image and then uploading all the bits to that and then making it public. For example, we'll say if there were 3 different operations, it just strings things together. So your level of granularity obviously decreases the higher up you go, but the amount of verbosity also decreases. So you have to write, one command is like 1 line of Python instead of 15 lines of Python or whatever. So that's SDK. OpenStack, to answer your original question, OpenStack client is kind of caught in the middle at the moment. So we've got 2 problems to solve. The first one is to implement all of, we'll say, the shell commands. So we have, for every command in Glance client and Cinder client and Nova client, we have an equivalent in OpenStack client. So instead of Nova boot, you have OpenStack server create. Instead of Glance create, you have OpenStack image create, stuff like that. That's part 1. Part 2 then is migrating what's library is actually being used under the hood from, we'll say, a legacy client to OpenStack SDK. So when I've been doing the first part, I've been continuing to use cinderclient because I know that the cinderclient bindings work because everyone's been using the shell historically. So it gives me a baseline to work from. And therefore, if there's a bug, then the bug is with OpenStack client, not with the library or whatever. But now that we're at the point where we'll say 85% of the shell commands for Cinder, we'll say, have been implemented, we switched to migrating away from Cinder client, the library, to OpenStack SDK under the hood. That applies, I think, across the board with the exception of Glance, because we never supported, I think Monty migrated the 5 Glance-related commands we had in OpenStack clients at the time to SDK maybe 4 years ago. So whenever somebody wants to add a new Glance-related command, they have to use SDK, which is slightly annoying, but it is what it is. So that's a lot of talking. Did any of that make sense?
Yeah,
it makes sense to me. I have, when I've written tools that happen to use the OpenStack SDK, I've used the proxy layers for the V3 version of the API. And what I have found, I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what was missing, but there were still some major either attributes or options or capabilities that was missing in the proxy that exists in the Cinder client lib, and that's what has always made me gravitate back towards the Cinder client and the lib underneath everything there, and why I still have given up on OpenStack SDK. So I think the biggest issue here for us is to migrate the APIs that we have inside of the Cinder client lib itself into that proxy to make sure that everything is kosher, and then I guess from there you can build out the shell options for all of the end user commands that will use that proxy.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go, to approach it as 2 separate things, and then we'll say adding OpenStack SDK equivalents for like Cinder client, the lib, and adding OpenStack client commands for cinderclient, the shell, and treating those as kind of separate things, and then eventually unifying them by using OpenStack SDK underneath OpenStack client. For the reasons I was saying about, you have a stable base to test against, or like a known working thing. From the OpenStack SDK, yeah, I suspect we probably have quite a few gaps there because that's one of the things that the interns haven't been looking at. The few interns that we've got from Boston University, and that they've been mostly looking at the shell side of things, and now they're not migrating Cinder, though. They're migrating most of the Nova stuff over to use OpenStack SDK, because our coverage in OpenStack SDK for Nova now is quite good, because that was done by interns. So yeah, definitely the area of focus, I think, is OpenStack SDK. The other thing as well, aside, this isn't going to be as noticeable and probably shouldn't be as high priority, but I'm guessing you talk to other projects, not least Keystone within Cinder. And to do that, you use Keystone clients and whatever. Probably not. No, I don't think you talk to Nova directly, so you probably don't use Nova client. But I know Nova has migrated. There was guys from Intel that migrated all of our Ironic client usage to SDK a while back. But we'll eventually have to do the same for our Cinder client usage and stuff at some point. I'd rather focus on the SDK, because that's directly beneficial for like Ansible users, and the OpenStack client because it's beneficial for like sysadmins, and then do the under the hood stuff later. So I think I had mostly, if not all, Red Hat people here. We did have an internal discussion about this a while back, and I think the point that I made was it was mostly feedback, I guess, we were looking for from the Cinder client team. So the Glance team, I saw this doc, and I'm in the process of editing it. So I got this doc from the Glance client team, which is a slightly more filled-in version of, the Glance team. It's a slightly more filled-in version of that converter doc we store in the OpenStack client tree. And all that they've done is the thing that I did for Nova a while back, just gone through each of the Cinder client or Glance client commands and compared them with the equivalent OpenStack client commands and said, like, is it present firstly, and is it working the way that we expect it to work? You'll see there's at least 2 cases where they've said, the behavior differs between the two. There's some verification going on in OpenStack client that doesn't exist in Glance client. That kind of feedback is useful because it means that we have interns to work on this stuff. So it's just a bit of direction to give them. One of the things that came up was OpenStack client was previously insisting that you use the name for an image when you created it, even though Cinder doesn't impose that. So once we knew that was an issue, we went and fixed it, and that's been fixed in 5.8.0, whatever the last release was of OpenStack client. That's probably, if the Cinder team were looking for areas to focus on, that would be a really helpful one to give us feedback on. This is the stuff that we think is wrong or misbehaves, so we can go and fix it. You don't necessarily have to write the code, although by all means, if you'd like to write code, then absolutely happy to review it. But that would be that's the thing that we're missing, because I don't use the, let's say, deeper level functionality. My exposure to Cinder is create a volume, attach it to a server, delete it when I'm finished with it, job done.
Didn't somebody from the Cinder team have a big spreadsheet tracking the gaps a little while ago? Anyone remember where that is?
Yeah, I think it was an EtherCalc document. Maybe I can find it out.
EtherCalc is gone though, so I hope it wasn't.
Yeah, I will just check.
yeah, if you can find something like that, and ideally if it was up to date, the reason that I mean, I could go and put this together, but like I said, I'm just going to end up asking you all the same other questions directly. How do I enable this so I can test it? And OpenStack is already complex enough for interns to ramp up on. I really don't want to have to ask them to figure out how to enable, let's say, clustering or whatever in Cinder, given that I have yet to figure out how to do that. So, yeah, if I have a thing and they can just say this is a concrete list of things that you have to do, that makes it much easier as kind of something that can be farmed up to interns.
Yeah, I think the old doc that was in the EtherCalc that no longer exists. I don't know if anybody took a copy of it. And it was pretty out of date though.
Yeah, I think what we can do is someone could actively start, can volunteer working on it, because we already have a OpenStack client page where the gaps are already mentioned, so we could take that as a reference for start, and then like Lance has added some comments regarding the discrepancies between commands and everything. We can prepare a new doc based on that. But I think the first action should be, is anyone interested in doing it? If not, I will do it. But if anyone is actively looking to work on OpenStack client for this.
Before, I've got another question about, I got lost in the documentation. There was a page that described the command structure and how things are visualized. So for Cinder, there's OpenStack volume stuff. And then there's also OpenStack, I think, block storage, and then commands. Is there something? So one thing I did notice is that there's some stuff that I think, so it seemed like the block storage stuff is mostly things that would be admin type things because they apply to the system more or less. And then the other stuff would be end user facing things about volumes. And it looked like the way you manage and unmanage volumes is in OpenStack volume, hidden in, it's not a command, it's hidden as a,
the import thing.
Yeah.
Import, or making the thing manageable.
Yes,
right. Externally, yeah.
Yeah. So my questions has to do with, as we look at, so from our point of view, as we look at it, there are some commands that should be in one section that aren't. How open are you to changing that, or do we have to worry about backward compatibility stuff? So for the
we have
thing, okay.
Yeah, we have the same deprecation kind of policy as every other project. So you deprecate in one release, and then you need to wait at least 6 months or one release before you can remove said thing. And then when we remove said thing, we bump the major version. The only exception to that is for something that has been around for a long time. In that case, we might keep the command around, but we'll hide it, or we'll keep a flag around, but we'll hide it, so it won't show up in help text. But if you pass it, it will it will continue to behave as it did to avoid breaking people, unnecessarily. Most of that the original architecture was set up by people that aren't working on the project anymore. So I think in that internal email that I mentioned earlier, I made the point that, say, OpenStack Client and OpenStack SDK don't and shouldn't aim to mirror the underlying APIs directly, because there's obviously warts and stuff in those underlying APIs just through the agent projects and that we don't necessarily want to expose. But we also don't, we can change whatever, basically. If there's a better way of doing something, or if yeah, and the current way of doing thing is confusing, then we can just change it or introduce an alias to whatever.
I think one place that shows up is, you were showing the example here of OpenStack resource action, but in the case of volumes, I think like a handful of things that were kind of verbs in the Cinder command line ended up hidden under the volume set section, where you do set attributes for retype, and there's a lot of things in there that I think some of us have been unsure if it's the best way to do it, but I haven't looked at it in a little while.
Yeah, well, that hasn't even been done consistently. Like we'll say, if you look at the compute commands, or most of the actions, if the compute commands have been exposed as, top level things. So for example, to stop a server, you don't do like OpenStack server set -- stopped or -- started. You don't do anything like that. You just do OpenStack server start, OpenStack server stop. So yeah, there's a good chance that a few of those should probably be dragged up higher level. We've also done similar things. So for example, the OpenStack previously, to confirm a server, you did the OpenStack server migrate -- confirm, which was silly because it was technically a completely different action. It wasn't like an option to like this particular operation. It was a separate operation. So now the way that that's done is obviously OpenStack server migration confirm, for example. Now we kept the old stuff as an alias with a deprecation warning, but it's deprecation as opposed to deprecation for removal. I don't know if we'll ever remove it because we don't really gain a whole lot by removing it. My point though is, that we can change all of those. They're unnecessarily buried. I don't see any reason not to.
Okay, in assessing feature equivalence, so we should pay attention to OpenStack block storage section of commands and OpenStack volume. Anything else that we should be looking at? Do you know that's related?
What you should pay attention to is, hold on, let me just check what the directory is actually called. Okay. So you should be paying attention to OpenStack /volume /v3. Everything related to Cinder lives in that directory. Now, in general, they're exposed under the OpenStack volume, that kind of namespace. The reason for the introduction of the block storage thing was we wanted to separate things that apply to, say, a volume as like a thing versus the volume service or the block storage service. Block storage was just, we could have done like OpenStack volume service additional stuff, but I wish we had hyphens in OpenStack clients and we were allowed to like have multi-part words without having to use spaces, because that annoys me, but that ship has sailed. So yeah, OpenStack client volume v3. Sorry, I got overthrown.
Even there is still code residing in the v2 directory, right? Like I see the v3 ones.
And OpenStack client, we won't add support. Same for OpenStack SDK. We generally won't add support for deprecated APIs, removed APIs. So for example, if we were adding support for v2 now, we wouldn't, because it's gone. But at the same time, we try not to remove support, because it means then that you can use, in theory, you can use OpenStack client against any version of OpenStack that has ever existed, in theory. Now, whether that stuff still works, I don't know, because we haven't any, let's say, Liberty Cloud available to actually test stuff against. But that's the theory, and that code is just sitting there. It doesn't really cost us anything to keep it around.
Yeah, I think the OpenStack client is expected to run against any release, right?
Yeah. Well, one exception to that is stuff that we consider, we'll say, actively harmful. So we removed some of the force stuff to do with migrations in Nova because it was a foot gun that was never, no one should ever do it, basically. So we just removed that foot gun. But that's a very small exception. That's the only one I can even think of. In general, we keep stuff around forever.
Okay, so I'm not sure if anyone thought about like driving this effort, but for the time being, I will add my name to it. I will try to create this parity doc and also the team's comment. If we see any command that needs to be updated or something that needs to be changed, yeah, I will add an action there.
One final point on this, I'm just loading up the Etherpad now. If that first link is a link to my deprecation patch, when I proposed, I don't know if it is, but when I proposed that deprecation patch, I hadn't considered the fact that Cinder can be used outside of OpenStack. So if that's the case, then I don't know if that means that you want to keep Cinder clients around for the long term. If you do, obviously, yeah, do. There's no issues with that. The reason, like, we deprecated it in Neutron, like the Neutron team deprecated it themselves, and the Nova team just did it in Yoga because neither of those services made sense as standalone services. So they only made sense as an OpenStack whole. So we were able to do that.
One other thing, we have this thing, the I forget what it's called, Python Brick cinderclient extension that allows you to use the cinderclient to do local volume attaches. Is there any support for anything like that in the OpenStack client?
Yeah, there's no issues with that. You've got OpenStack client is using OSC lib under the hood, which is using Cliff, and that loads stuff via entry points. So if you at the moment, if you install Python Neutron client, they install a whole load of additional Neutron related, like power user commands. Likewise, none of the Manila stuff is built into OpenStack client, let's say core. You have to install Python Manila client, and then you get all of these additional commands appearing when you do OpenStack help. So it's all pluggable, basically. And you can also extend stuff that's built into the core. I just don't think anyone's actually using that functionality. I think it might have been a bit over-engineered, but it can be done. That is something you could explore doing down the line, is moving all of the Cinder stuff out of OpenStack clients into Python Cinder clients and maintaining it all yourselves. I don't see any issues with that other than the cost of forklifting stuff out. But equally, we're happy to just give Cinder people core on OpenStack clients, so you're able to own your own dependencies as well. That's as easy and would involve less work, at least for me. So whatever works.
I kind of like that idea because if you deploy Cinder standalone, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to install the OpenStack client to talk to Cinder. If, say, for example, the Cinder client still existed and all of the code that the OpenStack client itself uses resides there, then
Yeah.
install a Cinder standalone Cinder client.
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah, you could wire up the, we'll say the Cinder entry, like Cinder command, to effectively be the same as OpenStack, only you'd only look at the Cinder related commands. There would be additional mapping needed, but yeah, there's no reason that couldn't happen. In fact, that might even be what Neutron is doing. Neutron client. Now they've deprecated that and probably since removed it, but that I had to go back and check. That might have been what they were doing, was using their OpenStack client bindings or plugins. That could be a good way long term to reduce duplication. Though I would stress it would be nice to get all of the gaps closed off first so we have something to might move across in terms of efforts, where to sink in effort.
From a developer's perspective, it makes a lot of sense, from at least logically to me, to have everything still in the Cinder client. And if you do an install of OpenStack client, you get that too. And so it's all together from a user's perspective. But from a deployer's perspective, I like having the OpenStack SDK around because it's very convenient for me to make calls into Keystone for doing stuff that I'm looking at. Cinder volumes, say for example, I want to find out who owns a particular project associated with the volume, and then I'm outputting that. Because I do that for some of the tooling that I write for managing my cloud, is I use the OpenStack SDK because it has all of the other projects built into it, instead of just using the Cinder client, except for for the cases where OpenStack SDK doesn't have the capability that should be there.
Yeah, and that would be one thing. The OpenStack client does depend on access to, for example, Keystone. So if you're doing something related to projects, I don't know, we'll say a volume. I don't know if you can move a volume between projects or whatever, but say you could, the project parameter that you pass to whatever the command is, we allow you to specify either a name or a UUID, and to figure out the name and resolve it to the actual UUID that the API requires, we obviously have to do a lookup to Keystone to retrieve that information. So you have an implicit dependency on a couple of other projects that might not make sense when Cinder's deployed in standalone mode. I'm guessing you don't rely on Keystone, or you don't have a dependency on Keystone in standalone mode. I don't know.
I think we require the middleware to be there, the Keystone middleware to be there, but not Keystone itself, because one of the auth options is no auth.
Gotcha.
Right. I thought there was a requirement at one point, though, that we remove Cinder client. Is that no longer a hard requirement?
I don't think there was ever a requirement, or if there was, it's long since gone. There's no requirement to get rid of it. The ask is to just have OpenStack client have parity with it. I think before you joined, Jay, I hadn't realized when I proposed the deprecation that Cinder standalone, I knew it, but I'd forgotten about it, that Cinder standalone was a thing, and therefore Cinder clients as a standalone thing continue to make sense in a way that it doesn't for Nova or Neutron client.
Okay. I had always wondered why I think that the concern had been that if Cinder client still existed, that we would never reach parity, but it sounds like we've made a lot more progress there, which is awesome.
Yeah, now we got rid of the shell in Nova because it was maintenance that we figured we no longer needed. But we've kept the client library bindings around for a while yet.
Okay.
As have
Cool.
Neutron, for that matter.
Makes sense to me.
think right now Nova doesn't accept new CLI changes, but as Stephen said, the bindings. So we can try to keep a similar model.
The only thing that concerns me is if the Cinder client underlying isn't the OpenStack SDK code, if you will, that we could still get to a place of not having total parity between the two.
Yeah, and perhaps, see, I don't know if it's an unnecessary dependency. Perhaps at some point, if you wanted to keep Nova's the opposite. Nova's keeping Nova client, the library around, because we'll say OpenStack client is still using it. We haven't migrated everything across, and my light's flickering. And there were, I guess, a couple of other users, and we figured that we'd wait another while before we got rid of that. But there is a chance for disparity there, like divergence over the long term. We've said that every time you add a new API microversion, you now need to submit patches against SDK and OpenStack client, as well as Nova client, but not the shell because we've deprecated that. But it's additional work, and we would obviously like to deprecate and remove Nova client the library at some point. So perhaps it might make sense, as you say, to move maybe not only the shell implementation from OpenStack client into Cinder client, so you can maintain it there, but also to start using OpenStack SDK and kill off Cinder client, the library as well. So we'll say you still only have a single code base, because OpenStack SDK should work with Cinder in standalone mode, as far as I'm aware. And if it doesn't, then it's probably able to be improved. The only stuff that might break again is stuff like projects where it has to do a lookup of another service to another service. That stuff would have to be hidden behind some kind of service availability check, whatever. This is all long-term speculative stuff, though. Again, I think closing the gaps is probably priority number one. So we actually have parity, and then we can start worrying about them diverging again.
Yeah, I think it was a good initial discussion, and we surely have some things to work upon on our side and can provide the feedback based on that to the OpenStack client team.
In that case, I might jump back into the Nova room. Give me a shout if you have any more questions, or like now or whenever. I'm on IRC most of the times.
Yeah, not related to this, but Stephen, you added another topic regarding the PrivZip in OSBrick migration. So do you prefer a time for that, or
Any
just ping you more?
Any time except for Friday. I'm on PTO Friday afternoon.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, whenever works, just give me a shout on IRC.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining and answering all of our queries.
Well, you all. Talk to you all later.
Yeah. Bye. So again, I don't see Christian replying to my RC message, so I think he's not around. I'm not sure if we should discuss it without him, or should we discuss any other topic?
My mind, such as it is, sort of wandered during this last discussion. Can we sort of summarize what we're going to do about the OpenStack client? So in terms of like what I mean is in terms of parity, should we be looking at the OpenStack SDK first, or should we be looking at the OSC command set?
I personally think that we should look at the OpenStack SDK first, because if the capabilities aren't there in those proxy calls, then you can't add the shell options to make use of those. From what I remember, I was looking at the OpenStack SDK about 2 or 3 months ago, and the release hadn't gone out yet, and they still didn't even have migrate volume in there. So they're still missing some major capabilities in the proxy object to actually do those commands. So I had to give up and use the cinderclient lib internally. So I think looking at the SDK and that proxy makes a lot more sense.
So what I kind of have a different opinion. So the OpenStack client currently depends on the Python bindings in cinderclient, like the OSC calls cinderclient for a lot of operations, and a lot of operations are already there. And I think the OpenStack SDK team, like the client team, was already working on bridging that gap. So I think the SDK part, as you mentioned, like if it doesn't even contain the migrate volume call, then it might take a lot of time, and then again this might get delayed. So I was thinking more on getting this parity done first, and we could start adding new commands to the OpenStack client, and in the meantime we can bridge this gap as well, the OpenStack SDK one.
Yeah, I mean, the OpenStack command line interface has volume migrate, presumably through the Cinder client code. So
yeah,
it's more just a question of what goal we're more interested in, I guess.
So I guess wasn't the idea overall that the OpenStack client itself was supposed to use the OpenStack SDK to do these operations eventually? Otherwise, we're going to have multiple areas of non-parity in this case. We're going to have the OpenStack client that kind of has parity with Cinder client, but OpenStack SDK doesn't, and we're having to add code in multiple places just to get what we already have in Cinder client.
I think at least for Swift, SDK actually uses the Swift client Python class. And also adds its own complications, like in case of Keystone, you have to have Keystone itself inside the catalog, stuff like that. But that's how they accomplish parity, at least for Swift.
Just looking at the requirements file for the OpenStack client, and it requires the Python Cinder client, Nova client, and Keystone client, as well as SDK. So there's multiple places that it's used to talk to Cinder. It's not just one. I think there's kind of a couple purposes that we're serving here, right? With respect to end users that want to use the OpenStack client and just do Cinder operations, and then there's people like me that want to use the SDK as well to talk to multiple aspects of the cloud.
Yeah, well, the command line is kind of like the face of the project. I think that's why most people who are not into like scripting it too much, they're mostly concerned that users, and that means operators, type OpenStack and then space on the command line and then command, instead of thinking what component is responsible to what and what it's called. It was a long-standing practice. Remember, they tried to get away from project names at some point, called everything like object storage, block storage. I think that's where it comes from. That's why it gets priority. But for anyone like you who does a lot of scripting, of course, it's a pain in the ass if SDK doesn't do something and you still have to fall back.
Yes, it is a pain in the ass.
Did you have
I
to
guess that's why I
fall
was
back all
kind
the
of
way to
questioning-
curl anywhere?
What's that? I'm sorry?
Have you ever had to fall back to curl all the way down to?
No, I fall back to cinderclient and use the internals inside there to do work. And outside that, I go directly to the database if I need to as well.
So I was poking
Yeah, I
around
think
while we were talking about this and looking at stuff that's missing from OpenStack client's command line. And at least two of the things I found there are not API features, but they're like command line features as far as having the volume create with a poll or wait command, and bash completion is not as good either, at least in how it's set up in DevStack. So I would not assume that the only gaps are OpenStack SDK related gaps, because it looks like there's some gaps just in the actual command line tooling that need work too.
I think this is the kind of stuff that eventually led us to just ignore the OpenStack client and work on cinderclient. Unfortunately.
Well, I think the notion now is that, you know, I mean, we were ignoring some of it before because we didn't have any ability to actually shift anything over there. And I think the hope is that now we actually can do that.
I guess both of the issues maybe can be dealt with in parallel. I can talk to Stephen for a follow-up, but I'm not sure how much efforts are put into OpenStack SDK as of now, as I've seen with the client part, OpenStack client to the Cinder connectivity part. Yeah, I will get a realistic idea of how much work is left in both the cases, the SDK one and these Python binding ones.
I'm not sure either. You know, every time we talk about this, somebody talks about the performance concerns around OpenStack client shell. I'm not sure I've still heard someone saying they were really going to go work on that. I mean, even if we reach feature parity and the thing is really slow, that's another tricky thing to figure out.
Brian, did that summarize the topic we discussed before? Since you asked for a kind of summary, but I'm not sure if that was done.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking in terms of, figuring out where to put effort first. But it sounds like we have to go after the OpenStack client, the command line thing first.
Okay, I think we at least have something to work upon as of now. So I will take a look at that, and yeah, I'm still not sure. I see the topics for other days are like I think we don't have enough topics that we should keep moving to today. So if people are interested, we can discuss Christian's topic, even though he's not around, and keep some notes so you can take a look at that later. Okay, so if anyone would like to, yeah, I don't have much idea about the whole thing, but I think Gorka did a brief explanation of what the issue was. Like when we are doing any operation on the volume, then like take for example the live migration, then we can't do a backup of it, or the other way around. Maybe the backup was ongoing, then we can't do a live migrate because of the status lock we have. Like if the volume isn't backing up, we can't do any other operation on it. So that seems to be the kind of issue. And
Well, I think from what I'm seeing in what it's written in the Etherpad right now, it's basically asking us, hey, are you going to do something about this spec? Right? I mean, it's...
Yeah, I think that's right.
just taking a look at the spec.
Yeah, I see you reviewed it and voted it. I don't know if it was just for the wording or if because you have 10 comments, or if actually you have real concerns with the implementation or something.
Okay, I seem to be forgetting. It is just loading for me, so I will just take a look. And
Yeah, okay. You wrote a general comment that I think conveys basically your concern with the spec. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's still loading for me. I don't know why it's so slow today.
So
I think his question is, so he's wondering whether it would be okay to just focus on trying to fix the backup issue, because that's what they're most concerned with, or whether we want to hold it up to do the full state machine with the subtasks.
well, the thing that I think it's important is that features like this are complex because we don't want just to have a patch in a specific combination of things. We want a general approach on could we have more, I think Rajat was writing, could we have more operations that benefit from this? Are there more interactions that can be used or that should not be used? Sorry, supported, not used. So that's the problem with this kind of things. We want to allow concurrently doing two operations, but we cannot just look at, yeah, this solves one case. We need to be sure that, okay, will this help with other things? Or is this just to be able to live migrate while doing a backup? Because this is probably going to be a lot of code everywhere just for one use case.
And how does this affect the effort to be able to safely shut Cinder down? We need to solve that as well. At some point.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would need to also check that. But I'm more concerned in if this only solves one problem, do we want all this extra code for that one?
Live migrations are fairly quick, aren't they? Relatively speaking.
If they don't fail, yes. But if you're doing the backup and you want to do the live migration, since backup is slow, so probably the issue is when you're already doing the backup, not when you do the live migration and you want to backup, I assume.
And you can't necessarily coordinate those because the backup is a user action in the live migration.
Yeah.
You know, that reminded me about my experience with Linode like 6 months ago, where they sent me email saying, well, we want to live migrate you away, but we cannot do it just ourselves. Please file a ticket that says, please migrate me. And if you do this, then we can migrate you. And we need to do it in order to like rotate some hardware. I was really surprised. But yes, I did that, and I migrated my VMs.
So you were nice enough to tell them it's okay.
Well, not only that, I had to actually request, but the thing is, like, it's not like I know anything about layout of their data centers. I just have to say, please migrate to the new host. Maybe they just wanted to make sure nothing goes wrong, so that I know that this is happening, or I don't know. But anyway, that was the practice, and that is a practice in some clouds. The remark about the backups being initiated by the user, but live migration being initiated by administrator brought this up as a, I don't know. Sorry, I'm just trying to get you off the topic, but.
Oh yeah, but the problem is that that some systems may do it that way, giving a notice to the users like this is going to happen, so that you're aware. But I assume in most cases they don't tell you. I need to evacuate this node for a rolling upgrade or whatever. I just move instances away.
Yes, exactly. That's how Amazon works. You never know what's happening there.
Exactly.
But in some ways they resolve it this way. They just say like everything like this comes from user and there is no conflict. So it's incumbent upon user not to run backups while he's being migrated. I guess in this situation, that's how Linode does it. Makes it simpler on themselves.
Yeah, but I think
and Linode is not an OpenStack cloud. That it may be just an implementation issue for them. So
the conflict I have is that I think this should be possible. It should be possible for the users to keep doing whatever they need to do, and for the system administrators to be able to do what they need to do when there is not a technical reason why it cannot be done. For example, there are other things we cannot do, and we say, yep, it's not going to support it because they conflict, the two operations. But in this case, there is not technical conflict because we are backing up a different resource because we either snap or clone. So that is fine. The only thing is how do we keep track of those two operations? Which is the subtask approach that was proposed here. I'm trying to come up with a simpler approach that could solve the problem. I don't know if anybody has any idea. Sorry, any ideas?
I'm still trying to remember like how the general idea would work. Like they talked about introducing a new task status field and use it in union with the status field we currently have. Was that the plan? Like I'm not sure how this used to work. I really forgot about it. But the main issue I had was the approach they were taking to do it. They were trying to create a very generic way of doing it. Like we use the status field for locking the volume in certain states. Like with the live migration one, it could be attaching, detaching, in use, reserved, and on the other side, they wanted the backing up. I understand these are two different operations and could be performed in parallel, but the state we have acts as a lock on the volume. That kind of, I think they were trying to allow different things with a particular state. Yeah, I will just go through the spec quickly to see.
The reason why they were trying this generic approach is because the Cinder community told them to. So they were trying to, let's say, hack something easily, but we said, no, we want a generic thing. And that's when they came up with this proposal. So we suggested this direction.
Okay, but that again like opens up possibilities for different things, like if we don't, yeah, again I don't remember exactly, but if we allow operations like if the user is performing operations like backing up and migrating, I don't think we want that to work, but not sure how this will be handled in the approach they have mentioned. Because both would read data from both will attach the volume and read data from it. So
not necessarily that you'll get attachment to the same volume for doing a backup, because you'll typically get a snapshot or a clone of the volume prior to doing the backup. So what you're actually reading from is not the original volume.
Yeah, that's the reason why this technically works.
Yeah, it should theoretically work.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of the calisthenics of Cinder managing these volumes more than anything else. The state of what Cinder thinks these volumes are in.
Mm-hmm. I'm also thinking about, I don't know, I haven't read the spec, or if I did, I remember nothing. But I don't know if this could help us with another problem that we currently have, which is that whenever Cinder attaches a volume to do an operation, for example, backup, or any operation where it needs to attach, we don't keep a record. So we don't use the attachments API. We just ask the driver, give me connection information. That connection information is not stored anywhere, and it is in flight. So this creates some problems. For example, you are trying to do a migration. The volume starts to migrate, so there is the volume is mapped and exported. Now something breaks, the service dies, whatever. Now it starts again, and you say, whatever, I will just delete the volume. But the volume is exported. And now you may get an error from the driver saying, cannot delete a map volume. And the reason why we wouldn't have a clean way of, well, a nice way to clean this up, because we don't use the attachment API within the Cinder operations when we do attachments. If we did, we would be able to clean this up ourselves, because there would be an attachment record with the connection information that we could just delete, and that could trigger the mapping from the backend. And I don't know if this sub-status could help us, because maybe we could track, we are doing a migration, we're doing a backup, we're doing whatever, and the status of the attach or detach of the volume would be tracked separately.
So Gorka, just to understand the reason behind it, so is it because when we had the legacy attachment code, at that time we implemented this concept of attaching, detaching, or is it because we had the new attachments API, but we still, so when we are migrating a volume, the attachment is an internal operation. So we intentionally didn't want to keep a record of it, just to understand why we are doing it this way right now.
I believe the issue comes from we have a single status, and that is visible by the user. So if we're doing a migration, we cannot say migrating suddenly reserved in use, because it could, from a user perspective, that would be crazy. I asked you to do a migration. I don't want to see the volume suddenly saying in use or something else. So we had a single way to store internal and external status of the operation. So what we did is we just said, whatever, it's migrating, it may be in use or detaching, I don't care. It's in part of the process. And we didn't bother to save the connection information at all, anywhere. So, and this is problematic, of course, because if something goes wrong, you don't even have the information. You don't even know that the volume is actually mapped and exported. So I think this comes from what we had in the database, the fields that we had, and we probably said, this is good enough. But now that we have the attachment API, we can actually make it easier to clean things up and to know what the status of a failed operation actually is. So I don't know if this could help with that. Not.
I totally agree with you. We should always be using the attachments table to keep records of what Cinder's doing to the volumes. We might need to alter the table or somehow denote that this is an internal attachment, because I think anything that's in there might be visible to end users looking at the volume, or admins, which I think is okay, I guess. But
I actually want it to be visible, because if they are doing a migration, something happens, the volume is in error migrating, they may want to see that it has an attachment, delete the attachment record, so that they can then delete the volume, because otherwise they will require a system administrator to either go to the backend, the array, and go and map the volume manually. That's not nice. And this was one of the things that happened before with the whole Cinder and Nova are out of sync regarding this volume. Nova says it's detached, Cinder says it's not. Now you try to delete the volume and you cannot, because it is mapped in the array. Somebody, a system admin, had to go to the storage array, look for the volume and map it manually, and then tell the customer, now you can delete it. But now with the attachment record, they no longer need to do that. A user can manually delete the attachment record themselves and solve the problem of the volume being in. Yeah, sorry.
How would an end user delete the attachment if it's an internal Cinder operation?
No, it's not. Okay. First,
sorry.
they can do it right now. They can do it with Nova and Cinder, because the attachment is not some admin thing. The attachment operations can be used by owner or admin, because that's the way that Nova is able to modify it with the context of user without needing to elevate it. So Nova uses the context of the user to modify and to create attachment. The volume is owned by a user, so that user is allowed to create attachments, to delete them, to list them. So a user can do it manually, or Nova can do it for them when it's doing the attachment in the cleanup. So that is how they can do it today with the Nova attach operation. The idea would be to also support this user interaction or this user cleanup when we are doing other operations, internal operations that require the attach.
Yeah, I understand the user aspect of being able to see and delete those, but there's no API that a user can say, I want to delete this attachment today, especially if it's just an internal Cinder operation.
Oh, today? today, today they have an API to do it for Nova attachment. They don't have it for the internal stuff because we don't use attachments in the internal code. But if we did use it, then they would be able to clean things up with the same API that we have.
And so if Cinder is taking some other action on that volume for whatever reason, and it has an attachment record for that that's not attached to a VM, and they try and delete that volume, what will we do at that point?
So the thing is that usually when we could Nova, o sea, Cinder, if somebody requested delete this volume and Cinder saw, oh, it has an attachment record that is not from Nova, so it's probably something that broke for me. We should fail and we should tell them there is an attachment, and they can go and delete the attachment if they are not making a mistake. So we just fail, but they have a way to do something about it. Whereas now they have nothing to do. If they try to delete a volume and the volume is mapped and the driver fails because it is mapped, a user cannot do anything to fix the situation. They have to contact the system admin. And what I was saying, I don't want to get too much into that, but I was wondering if this feature that we're discussing of the subtask could be leveraged for this. That's what I'm wondering. So that it would not be useful for just one single thing.
To allow this, we need to keep track of the attachment separate from the operation. Like you said, it is very confusing when status changes from migrating to reserved and attaching. So while doing an operation, an internal attachment should be kept. Like what I'm thinking is there should be another field to keep track of it, so we don't modify the actual status of it.
Yeah, we can probably even do it just creating the attachment and making sure that the code that we have for the status of the volume knows that of these other statuses, because right now the volume status it is automatically managed based on the number of attachments that there are. So if you have one attachment and you delete the attachment, the volume becomes available.
Yeah.
That is how it works today. If you have two attachments, because for example, you're doing a live migration, a live instant migration, you have two attachments, you remove one, the volume still remains in use because there's still one attachment. So we would have to contemplate that all the internal cases like migration if we use the attachment.
Yeah, you could just add another field for, this attachment is for a live migration and it's a temporary attachment that will go away or something like that. I guess my concern that I was getting at earlier is what are we actually exposing to end users? And I still am not totally bought into the idea of exposing the internal Cinder attachments to end users where they aren't really supposed to know what's going on behind the scenes, except that these overall operations are supposed to work.
Yeah, but since reality, I agree with you. It should not be necessary. But what I'm wondering is, considering the number of problems that Cinder has, and if it would not be good to provide this feature. Let me put it another way. Today, you can attach a volume, you can shoot yourself in the foot easily. attach a volume to an instance. Now go cinder attachment list, cinder attachment delete for that. And there, boom, gone. Your VM no longer have access to the volume because you broke the attachment. You unmapped the volume forcefully.
No, I totally agree with the idea of using the table itself for these internal attachments. I just think that we should flag it as an internal attachment and go through the scenarios of deciding whether we want to make them visible to end users. This is a totally different thing.
Yeah.
Because I totally I deal with volume inconsistencies on a daily basis in my deployments where volumes become in this weird state where we have attachment entries, but you go look at the VM and the volume's not there, and we look at the back end VMware and it's like you don't have an attachment, but Cinder thinks you do, or vice versa. We have the inverse of that as well, where Cinder has no idea that it's attached, but the VM is using it. And it's totally fine. And hey, we get into really, really bizarre situations with all the inconsistencies of the states and stuff. So I think if we're using that table to track more internal commands where we know Cinder is actually doing an attachment, I think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, and I was wondering if this table could help us for those situations. Just wondering.
Yeah, I think maybe we can modify the table and add some sort of code or something like that for the purpose of this attachment as well. If it's an end user attaching to a VM, if it's a backup, if it's a, anything like that might help people like me figure out why I still have this attachment record in the database and what it's for, where it came from.
Yeah, I think we have a limited number of internal operations where attachments are used, so the purpose of it, and we could also append the live migration one to allow, to keep the state and the new field to allow the particular use case we are discussing.
Just to give an example, the backup case, when you clone the volume to do the backup, that's a temporary volume that has its own flag saying this is temporary. When cinder-backup attaches it, that one does not have a record of the attachment. That is because previously I was talking about migration, but also backup. We have this situation where we don't keep the record of the connection information. In any case,
keeping that around would be a good idea to have for when we need to actually tear Cinder down as well. It wouldn't be an orphaned attachment at that point. Cinder wouldn't have knowledge about it when it comes back up.
Yep. If a backup breaks, or we just tear it down and leave the backup in the middle, when it comes back up and we want to delete the temporary backup or whatever, temporary volume, yes, we would be able to clean it up easily. But going back to the Christian spec, does anybody have any other alternative that we could support what they want to support, which is being able to separate the live migration from other operations? the easiest one that I can think of is just allowing it. You can always, but yeah, it's not about allowing it. It's about, yeah, never mind.
During time migration, we only have like the attached status, and we don't know where this attachment is coming from, right? Like we don't know if a live migration is going on.
I think that's correct because it bypasses a lot of the normal attachment API to force a new attachment right now.
I think we
If I
know
remember correctly.
that it's a live migration, but the way we know it is very hacky. I'm trying to remember, there is some weird code in there trying to figure out, is this a multi-attach case or is this the same one? And I think it may come from checking the instance UUID. I'm not entirely sure, but in theory, we are able to discern when we are doing one case or the other, when it's live migration and when it is multi-attach. Well, I don't think we are making much progress into this.
I found out the code for the one you mentioned, Gurkha, and yeah, pasted that in the Etherpad.
Yeah, but still, I'm thinking that it doesn't help us knowing that this is a multi-attach because the Nova code, if I remember correctly, checking the cinder status. So it expects to be able to say reserved, to say, you know, it is expecting the normal cycle of a state changes when doing the live migration. And that is not going to happen. And I think that's the reason why we require a task change. One thing, if I read your comment correctly, Rajat, your main concern was if this feature was only going to be used for one use case. And also your other concern was to make sure that we suddenly don't start allowing operations that we didn't allow before. I believe those were your main concerns.
Yeah, right. Like the use case was very narrowed down and it opened the possibility, as I read at that time, it opened the possibility to allow multiple operations to concurrently happen different. So we need to keep track of everything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think the first one being only, how do I say it? This feature only being helpful for one specific case, maybe that's not the case if we also use it for the keeping track of attach and detach during other operations, that's something that can be explored that would resolve your first concern. And regarding the second one, I believe it's a matter of making sure that the implementation does not allow something that is, how would I say, that it doesn't have bugs. That's basically what I would say.
Yeah, the attachments one, I think we were just exploring like performing attach and detach when some other operation is going on. So that is very limited as compared to the task status, which I think was for a very wide case, but I'm not sure. But I really like the one you mentioned about the attachments one.
Yeah, because in theory, we could have subtasks within a same status to know what is actually happening. Is it attaching? Is it copying data? What is happening at each point? Because from a user perspective, it's quite blind what's going on. We have no idea. And even from a system administrator, if you don't go to a logs, you have no idea what's going on in the operation because we don't have greater granularity than the status itself. So maybe we just have to have another look at this, looking to see if this can be used for other things.
Yeah, I think that would be good. And we can convey the same to Christian if he thinks it will, which we think it will address his use case. But
What do you mean if it addresses his use case? Actually, because I'm not saying to change this, is basically asking him, do you see any other use case where this can be useful? And we can also look at the attach and detach after reviewing the spec.
yeah, so the attach, so the keeping
Sorry.
track of the attach.
Yeah, that. So that is something that we can look at, but Christian could probably look into whether he can think of other cases where this table could be useful. Basically, we both would be looking into other cases. I can write it down, Rajat.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Well, I think we have exhausted this topic for now, right?
Sorry, I didn't get you, Kuka.
Yeah, I was saying that we have probably exhausted everything we wanted to talk about this, considering that most people are probably daydreaming by now.
Yeah, and yeah, we are also reaching the end of today's PTG session as well. I will just stop the recording.